Hey guys, it's Divest. Today I wanted to talk about agriculture and what normal people don't understand about food systems. Let's get into it. I actually studied agriculture in university before I was super rich. What I learned made me very critical of our agrarian systems. The first point I would like to make is that nothing comes for free from farming. Everything in a plant or animal comes from chemicals in the air and, more importantly, in the ground. The stuff in the air is practically limitless because plants use solar energy to metabolize them. But in the same way a human cannot survive on nothing but sugar and water, a plant can't either. They require nutrients from the soil, which depletes it. There are organic ways to rejuvenate the soil, but in the real world, a major facet of industrial agriculture is mining to synthesize lost nutrients in the soil to get the volumes of plants we need to feed people. That also means there's no such thing as waste products when it comes to the food system. A common soundbite I hear is that animal agriculture isn't inefficient because animals are fed parts of the plant that humans can't eat. So a steer is actually only eating however many pounds of grain because it also eats the straw. When in reality, that just means they are extracting more nutrients from the soil because they are incentivized to replace those nutrients with stuff that is mined somewhere else. Another common argument in favor of animal agriculture is that you can't get nutrients from eating a vegan diet, with the most common example being vitamin B12. In reality, livestock have their feed supplemented with nutrients like vitamin B12 that don't exist in high enough concentrations to sustain heavy industrial livestock weights. Every animal we eat is fed a diet that is supplemented to be more fit for a strong man. No one can really get an ideal combination of nutrients without supplements. For instance, you would need to eat 2,400 calories of beef or 1,100 calories of bananas a day to get your daily need for potassium out of a 2,000 calorie a day diet. Or you can take a supplement. And this probably isn't just the result of nutritional density falling as yields increased, though that is a problem. It was just that we have never been at a point in our evolution where it was viable to have a perfect diet. We just had to have enough nourishment to survive long enough to pass on our genes. Vitamin B12 depletion is caused by petrochemicals in the soil. Poisons like Roundup destroys the bacteria in the soil that produces vitamin B12. In reality, animals don't produce vitamin B12, they have it supplemented in their diet from stuff synthesized in a bioreactor. So the agricultural practices used to promote meat consumption also destroyed natural nutritional properties in our food, and the solution involving eating meat is to just do what vegans do, but with reduced efficiency and extra steps involved. In the real world, vegetarians and vegans have the healthiest average vitamin B12 levels because they know more about nutrition than the general population. And this is only one of the many health outcomes you have to consider with animal products in your diet, because there is a direct correlation between increased consumption of meat and increased risk of heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, cancer, hemorrhoids, bowel disease, chronic inflammation, depression, sexual dysfunction, and even domestic violence. Now, I would also like to temper what I am saying about meat being bad by adding that I don't recommend going on a completely vegan diet if you can't handle it. I simply want you to be more mindful of your food choices and trend towards making better health decisions with this information. You can just reduce your meat consumption gradually, ideally by experimenting with eating alternatives to meat, like having a smaller portion of meat with some beans or tofu, for instance. As an example, while I am generally meat avoidant, I will eat animal products and meat in certain contexts, like I won't order a steak at a restaurant, but if I eat some food with oil in it, I will adopt a don't ask, don't tell policy on how that oil was sourced, so it could be lard or it could be rapeseed. I also eat genuine cheeses, which are restricted to using rennet as a curdling agent by European law, like Parmigiano Reggiano. Now let's talk about the environmental cost of our agriculture system. Farmers are completely wrecking the environment and polluting everything, which then moves on down into your food and your water systems. For instance, the state of Iowa uses more of the active ingredient in Agent Orange every season than the military sprayed in Indochina during the Vietnam War, and it causes mass die-offs in fish populations as far as the Gulf of Mexico. Because that shit never goes away, it just keeps on accumulating in the ocean. Now I think using Agent Orange is valid in a military context as a weapon you use against your enemies, but in the same vein I wouldn't advocate shooting and burning people with napalm to be an integral part of the food system. There's also enormous quantities of animal waste that leach into your water, which is where E. coli and algae blooms come from. Speaking of disease, livestock also creates antibiotic-resistant bacteria because they mix antibiotics into their feed to reduce the impact of their unhygienic conditions. And most of the plagues we have to deal with are also the result of the food system. Influenza strains come from the virus, mutating to infect humans who are in close proximity to birds and swine. COVID came from some animal, though we're not sure if it was livestock or not. Farming also consumes massive amounts of non-renewable groundwater. Farmers also wipe out wild animal populations of all shapes and sizes, lobbying to drive species into extinction to help their profit margins. Brazil is an example where we can see some of the most extreme problems caused by greedy, short-sighted, and evil farmers. Farmers start forest fires to clear out the Amazon for cattle ranches and wipe out uncontacted tribes in the region so that they can claim the land. So this is the bait and switch part of the video because obviously we need to have food and there will be external costs to any product, even food systems. My problem with the narrative around agriculture is the false dichotomy that we couldn't do this without, committing genocide. About 90% of the damage to our food system is entirely unnecessary. It's the result of welfare policies being corrupted. Back during the Great Depression and the Second World War, the American government started creating artificial demand for agricultural products and farm labor by encouraging animal agriculture to waste surplus food. But over time, these systems have become more entrenched as automation and urbanization reduced the demand for farm labor and drove people in the city. This is the case in most advanced economies now. You have some boomer who receives millions of dollars a year to waste resources because he inherited a piece of farmland that 100 years ago people needed to work to survive. Or you have a venture capitalist who buys up huge swathes of farmland and then gets a handout from the government as a result of accumulated wealth instead of innovation. The biggest argument I hear is that we need to do this for food security, but in reality this doesn't have any benefit to our food security here in the West, because this is all determined by global market pressures and individual wealth, like it has been for hundreds of years. As an example, the global supply chain disruption caused by Russia invading Ukraine led to starvation in Africa, not because there wasn't enough food, but because the constriction of supply led to an increased price of grain beyond what the poorest people in the world were able to afford. The same thing happened during the potato famine. The poorest British people in Ireland and Scotland starved because they couldn't afford to pay for food when supply got constricted and prices increased, which is where the story about grain getting shipped to England from Ireland came from. The English people were able to pay more for the grain because they were wealthier, and so it went to them. So Western civilizations are hardened against starvation because it only really impacts the poorest people on Earth. Even a Moldovan wouldn't have to worry about starvation in a famine because a Congolese person is poorer than them. Plus, globalism means the agriculture is inherently decentralized, so if you can't get a specific crop from one area, you can get it somewhere else. Like, for instance, China importing agricultural products from Brazil because they're less confrontational than America is. The only alternative would be some sort of autarky system like North Korea, so let's explore that hypothetical. Of course we need food, but these systems are putting our access to food in jeopardy since they're not making food and instead are wasting the resources we need to make food. Imagine if you're the president of America or Europe and you get cut off from global food trade, so you have to rely on your domestic food supply and your farmers. If you use our current food system, then everything is going to break down. All of the farmers are going to be invested in growing crops for animals, but they're not going to be able to import the chemicals they need to sustain the plant growth, to protect against pests and weeds, to power their irrigation systems, and the soil is going to be completely degraded without it. Most of the food you have saved will only be edible by livestock, so your best bet at that point is to slaughter less efficient animals like beef, pork, and mutton to save feed for egg-laying hens and dairy cattle, which are the most efficient livestock. My alternative to our current industrial agriculture system is that we make farmers pay for the damage they cause, instead of subsidizing the worst kinds of food. This would make healthier organic and plant-based diets cheaper relative to the meat and processed food-heavy diets we have now, which would cause changes in consumption. Now getting rid of subsidies would increase the price of inefficient food at the grocery store, but the consumer would be better off, not just from the environmental and dietary improvements, but also because the resources saved by not subsidizing destructive agriculture could go to other places in the economy, like giving poor people food stamps. Staple food products made from grains, beans, and vegetables would actually drop in price, in contrast to animal products, since there would be a shift to producing more plants for human consumption, consequently increasing supply. This would also cause large sections of unprofitable arable land to get rewilded. And as for the resilience of the food system in case of a political crisis, in my model, you wouldn't have to rely as heavily on globalized supply chains of agricultural chemicals, and if you have a bunch of fallowed arable land, then you have the option to expand food production into that land. Taking a hint from pre-industrial times, you can slash and burn overgrown unused arable land, harvest the wild game on that land, and then grow crops on it until the food situation is stabilized. If the land is always being used to support more biofuels and more animal agriculture to boost GDP and make work for farmers, then you're never going to have surplus biomass or fresh water to dip into when you really need it. So to quantify that, you could get about 105 trillion food calories per year from German arable land, assuming you use 20% of the arable land for farming and fallowing the other 80% on a 5-year cycle, against about 91 trillion calories for 3,000 calories per day per person. It's not even worth it to calculate how many calories you could get for meat with the same area. It would be like 2 trillion or something. That is if you were to use animal husbandry, though. If you used the food to make cultured meat, then the results would be comparable to what you would get with plants, but you would have to put a buttload of electricity in as an extra step. Still, it's way better than meat, which is why the farmers who supposedly work tirelessly to curb global hunger lobby to ban cultured meat. Now, in contrast with all my rambling about the downsides of industrial monocropping, animal agriculture, and farmers, I would like to talk about the unsung heroes of our modern food system, which are big, evil corporations like Monsanto. Corporations that are constantly making new chemicals and new plants is the only reason we have gotten to reduce hunger as much as we have. It's a stark contrast. When my father was a child in East Germany in the 60s, his family used to poach snails and frogs because there was never enough food to go around. Now he takes semaglutide because he can't control himself with all the tasty food available to him. It wasn't the farmers who made food so abundant, it was Monsanto and their GMOs. In the real world, a farmer is just a useless loser who leeches off of everyone else and pretends like he contributes to the food system, when in reality the manure he spreads on his field is more valuable than his entire life. If it wasn't for the infrastructure and technology the urban intellectuals created for him, then he would be working 4 acres a year with oxen. Now most farmers are 130-kilo narcoleptics who fall asleep at the wheel of their tractor and can still get their job done because the tractor is guided by GPS. Finally, GMOs are good for you too. Humans have been manipulating the genome of their food for tens of thousands of years, so your idea of what is natural is bullshit, and even if natural food existed, it would probably be worse for you than what we have now. There are a lot more animals in the world that starve to death compared to ones that can bake a loaf of bread, which means that eating bread is less natural than dying, for instance. And you're not going to convince me that you're not a fucking moron who deserves to be ignored if you say that people should get beriberi so that they don't give their money to Monsanto by cultivating golden rice. Fuck you, Alex. We get a lot of alarmist videos on the supposed lack of variety of plants we eat now. This isn't a real problem, though. The fact of the matter is that we have selected out the best plants from the species we eat to further improve, while most of the stuff we don't eat anymore is crap. As an example, goosefoot was grown by pre-Columbian Americans, but the people who grew it moved on to growing maize, potatoes, and cassava because they were better staple crops. The variety of industrially viable staple crops we grow now is fine. The other one I hear a lot is people whining about how we clone plants so they're susceptible to the same diseases. In the real world, there is no alternative to that, though. If you plant apple seeds, the resulting tree could bear completely inedible or poisonous fruit. So it's useless to not clone plants like apple trees, except for experiments to breed new trees worth cloning. So the best thing you could do is to genetically modify cloned plants to give them disease resistances from other breeds. I think that wraps up most of what I want to talk about when it comes to agriculture. Let me know if you learned anything in the comments or if you want to argue with me. Until next time, this has been Divest.